Turning to the first jobs report of the new year, it was a blockbuster one. The U.S. economy added 312,000 jobs in the month of December. The unemployment rate did tick up slightly higher to 3.9%, but wage growth also very strong. Average hourly earnings climbed 0.4% from November. The gain year over year was 3.2%. That is the largest year over year gain, strongest wage growth since 2008. Here now to weigh in, SkyBridge Capital founder, former White House communications director, author of Trump, the Blue Collar President, Anthony Scaramucci. Anthony, so good to see you, my friend.
Dagan, it's great to be here, and early happy birthday to you.
Back at you, my friend, my fellow Capricorn. We're going to make some waves right here, right now. Listen, there were so many concerns about the U.S. economy that really started particularly in early November about what the Federal Reserve was doing to it, weakening. What does this jobs report say about the health of the U.S. economy?
So, I mean, we've been saying consistently that the health of the economy is very strong. The underpinnings of the economy are strong, very good fundamentals. And obviously the unemployment rate ticking up because there's more labor participation. And so that was one of the issues during the Obama years, that you had very low labor participation. And so people are engaged and they're making more money. And so this is a very, very positive thing. One of the reasons why the Federal Reserve had to move and will likely move again is that you got to make sure that we're taming inflation. When you're in a period of time where the federal government is borrowing this amount of money, one of the things the Federal Reserve has to protect the United States from is a dollar crisis. And so raising rates because of the strength of the economy also helps the Treasury go into those capital markets in a much easier way. I mean, God forbid you got a dollar crisis going on and we're at the tail end of an economic cycle.
Having worked in the White House down in Washington, D.C., what does this administration, what does the Trump administration do in terms of fiscal policy to follow through with what we saw in the last year? The average job growth last year was 220,000 jobs per month. That was even faster than the year prior, which is kind of unprecedented given the length of this economic growth cycle, and the best job growth since 2015. How do you follow through on tax cuts? Because people on the left will argue that that actually is helping pump up the national debt and the amount of money that we're borrowing. So what do you do on that note? And even in the Federal Reserve communications, which President Trump's been hammering Jay Powell, right or wrong?
Well, yeah. I mean, listen, I mean, I understand why the president is hammering Jay Powell, because interest rate sensitive areas of the economy are slowing. And so what the president's saying is have a little bit of a softer touch as it relates to the movement of interest rates. Up against that, though, is what I'm saying. You're going into the capital markets for another $1 trillion of debt. And so you have to make sure that people know that we're going to protect the currency and not have too much inflation. So that harmony, if you will, is a little bit disrupting because of the way the president's tweeting at him. He'd be way better off, and the markets would be way better off. He just brought him into the Oval Office, and they had a conversation in the den, let's say, or the study off the Oval Office. So
that's in the works potentially.
I hope that happens, because I think it'll clear the air, and I also think that the president has a good touch for people once he's in their presence, and I think it'll calm the president down. The same way the president was probably upset about Rod Rosenstein, one of my classmates from law school in my section. Rod Rosenstein's a Boy Scout. He flies on Air Force One with the president and comes back to his job, and so all of that raucousness around him died down. So I hope that happens, but. Secondarily, what you're talking about is fiscal policy, and so they've done a very good job on three things, and they need to do a better job on one thing. What are the three things? Number one, they set a pro-business agenda, and the president is a pro-business person, so he's changed the market psychology and the bully pulpit that way. Number two, they're delayering the administrative state, and they're taking down regulations that are actually unnecessary on the economy. Very, very positive. And the third thing, through the tax policy, they're trying to figure out a way, which really hasn't happened 100% yet, but to repatriate capital off the shore of the United States, bring it back into the United States, and have that development take place. And one of the things that's slowing that down, is the fourth thing that they need to improve on, is the communication around trade and the eventual resolution of the trading situation with our largest partners, which include Europe and China. Once we do that, you're going to calm down corporate America, you'll calm down the industrials, and these CIOs, these chief investment officers at these companies, will be able to start allocating capital back into the United States on 3, 5, 10-year plans. When you have this much uncertainty about trade, you have this much uncertainty about the rhythm of the economy as a result of the trade, you have a tendency to slow down. That psychology alters your behavior. It'll ultimately alter the economy and the stock market.
In terms of the communication, I think that the American people, regardless of the political party they belong to, understand now the way the president communicates, and they have learned to accept it via Twitter. Very firm rhetoric from the president, but they have not, in terms of the market and investors, all of the people around the president who love to go on TV, who love to say things, and it's almost as if they go on TV trying to impress the president, and it lacks message, does it not? And I mean Wilbur Ross and Peter Navarro, even Secretary Mnuchin, that they're not helping the agenda and the president. They're hurting at times.
Well, I work with all those guys.
Yeah.
I like all those guys, and I think that they're in general doing a very good job. But one of the things that I found, and I was only there for a very short period of time, 11 days, but what I found was that there needed to be more coordination between the White House and the departments. And I think one of the things that Bill Shine is probably looking at and trying to do
former head of Fox
News is like, okay, the White House would be, Fox News headquarters, and then these branches would be the affiliates or the stations that we're tied into, or our offices, say in Los Angeles or places around the country. And so you have to have some uniformity in the messaging, and if they continue to improve on that uniformity, that too will also be good for the stock market.
And also stop going on TV, and I don't mean the president, because he was lambasted by some about what he was saying about Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve, and then the market some months later it clearly agrees with the president in terms of the Fed needs to cool it, the Fed needs to maybe even cut
you get very good touch, very good intuition on the economy.
Right.
There's no question about that.
But again, people going on and trying to juice the market because they know that the market performance is important to the president, so they're trying to kind of curry favor with him. That's how I read it, and I just
Well, I mean, listen, I would just say that doesn't work, and so. Yeah, I understand why they're doing it, and I understand a lot of people message to the president through TV, and I get that they want the president to realize that they're on side and extremely loyal to the president. But there's a flip side of the loyalty. You have to be very careful because you don't want to slip into sycophancy or over-flattering, because what I find this in my own corporation, sycophants, that word is way closer to self-preservation and selfishness. It's not loyalty. Loyalty requires honesty. Loyalty requires constructive feedback and constructive criticism. Dagan, someone...
I've never liked people who genuflect.
Well, that's
unless they're in front of the Pope.
You and I are under the same star sign. But for me, I tell my staff, if you're calling me tall and right, I know I got a problem. Okay? If you're calling me short and wrong, now I know I got a relationship.
But you are handsome.
Okay, well, I appreciate that.
Okay, you're welcome.